Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Titan PI TV, where we're looking at the inside workings of a live operational investigation agency, that being here, Titan in Derby. I am your host and Managing Director of Titan Private Investigation, and I am Simon Henson. Today's short episode, we are looking at what are the different types of surveillance and when are they used. There are many forms, so let's quickly go through them and then I'll go through them individually. So we have static surveillance, mobile surveillance, foot surveillance, technical surveillance, counter surveillance and anti-surveillance. So first of all, I'm going to look at static surveillance. So let's look at static surveillance initially. It is as it sounds. It is a surveillance which is from a static position, utilising one surveillance operative. This is intended to be used when there is no requirement to follow a subject away from an address. So it is purely looking at an address or something which is static, but we're not following anyone away from that as a result. So examples are, it might be to prove cohabitation of two people. So there is a divorce in place. We need to prove cohabitation because it is suspected that that's happening. The reason we might need to prove it is because it affects the outcome of the Form E, which is the financials. If we're able to prove that two people are cohabitating, then both potential incomes or other properties will be taken into account when the other party is looking at splitting up assets. So it is important for that. It might be that we need to serve an individual that is being able to evade being legally served in person. So it might be that we're watching an address for that person to return. Then we can knock on the door. If they don't answer, we can speak to them through a letterbox. We know they're in there because we've seen them enter, and we can just leave the papers because we know they're in the house. So we know that they will receive them and it is formally served. It might be we need to identify from a landlord. They believe that one of their properties is being subletted. So it may be that we're watching a property to see who comes and goes from it to try and work out who are the current tenants. It might be that it's an employee meeting a competitor, which is a direct conflict of interest. So we know the meeting place, and Starbucks coffee, for example, on Pride Park in Derby, and we go and set up a static observations or put one operative in there to be able to evidence the meet. The list is endless. However, it is utilising one operative within a camera platform, whether that be a vehicle or a property, and there is no requirement to follow anybody away from the address. If there is a requirement in that example I've just given for a subject or subjects to be followed away from address and they get into a vehicle, then this is what we call mobile surveillance. If they exited the address, or he or she exited the address and walked away on foot, then this is called foot surveillance. So as soon as we get into mobile or foot surveillance, it requires a minimum of 2 operatives. If it's vehicles, because it's a mobile surveillance, it will need potentially a minimum of 2 single crewed vehicles. If we're looking in London, then it might be 1 double crewed vehicle, 1 single crewed vehicle, and then a bike or a taxi, so that we're able to deploy foot units, because there's so many more risks with public transport, etc., in a capital city or a large city. If we're in Derby, though, it's more than likely to be 2 single crewed cars. If it's on foot, it is likely to be 2, and there's no discussion or intelligence to suggest that the subject will be using public transport. There's nothing other than walking into town and meeting someone. Then it would be 2 surveillance operatives on foot. The reason it's 2 is because if we think of an example where you come out your house in the morning and you travel to work, if there was a vehicle that was behind you in your car all the way to work and followed you into the car park, I would imagine after 2 or 3 turns, whether you're surveillance aware or not, you would realise that it's the same vehicle behind you. If you walk to work, you might look naturally just to cross over a road and notice someone behind you. If you see that same person a mile down the road when you look to cross the road again, then you will probably be thinking, why is that person walking the same route as me, and feel a little bit, your personal space is invaded and maybe a little bit threatened. However, that is a surveillance. But with one person, it can't be done. We use a minimum of 2. And the reason for that is for those reasons I've just given you. So they won't do more than 1 turn in a vehicle or 1 turn on foot. they will hand over to the other operative to share exposure. So it's not the same vehicle in your rearview mirror all the way to work, and it's not the same person crossing the road and following you all the way to your work on foot. So that is foot and mobile surveillance. Technical surveillance. Technical surveillance is the use of beacons, or in our industry, certainly the government would use beacons. In our industry, it's more likely to be in form of GPS vehicle tracking devices, which purely use GPS and not beacons. These are deployed onto vehicles covertly, and they record the location of which a vehicle travels and stops, and then where it moves again. This is purely a surveillance aid though. It is intelligence, it is not evidence, because all it's telling you is location data of where a vehicle is. It doesn't tell you who's in the vehicle, who's driving, who's the occupant, what they're doing in that car. When the vehicle stops, it doesn't tell you where they go. So it is purely an intelligence aid or a surveillance aid. It does not give you evidence unless it is potentially combined with a physical surveillance. That's technical surveillance. Let's look at counter surveillance. Counter surveillance is when you have a subject and he believes he is being followed. So it might be the example earlier where we're using one operative and it's made our subject aware because it's the same operative. Or it might be that they're driving to work and it's the same vehicle because they're cutting corners and using one surveillance operative. As a result, Titan gets a call. The subject, who is our client, says to us, I think I'm being followed. So we would, in these circumstances, use counter surveillance. Counter surveillance is when you use a third party, i.e. Titan's operatives, to try and locate and identify whether there is a surveillance team on a subject. This could be done quite crudely by us just doing a surveillance on our subject and seeing if there are any other surveillance teams between us or behind us whilst we're following our subject. Or it can be done more professionally, where a professional route is planned, which isn't out of the ordinary and is generally the subject's routine, so it doesn't alert if there is a surveillance team behind them as a break to routine. And we would basically ask our subject to go through certain areas which are what we call choke points, where there is no alternative route or on near side or on offside, to be able to follow the subject without going through this funnel or this choke point. If we send our subject through these choke points, we just record and gain imagery of everybody or every vehicle that comes through with the subject. Once we've gone through 2 choke points, if we've got the same person or same vehicle, then we know we've got a surveillance team. So that is counter surveillance, when you are using a third party to identify whether there is a surveillance on a subject. So the third area is anti-surveillance. Anti-surveillance is when, once again, like counter-surveillance, our subject believes that they are subject to a surveillance. However, they don't use Titan and our operatives, third parties, to identify whether whether he or she is being surveilled. They use themselves. So anti-surveillance is where you could do very crude anti-surveillance to see if you're being followed, which would be to suddenly turn around or go round a corner and wait to see who comes round after and go, haha, I got you. That could be very crude anti-surveillance. But if this is identified by a surveillance team, they would just stand down, so you're probably not going to get any answers. What a professional person or someone that's experienced at surveillance would do if they thought they were being surveilled is they would perform professional anti-surveillance. So that might be walking particular routes, using shop windows, for example, to be able to see reflections, to see who's following them. But anti-surveillance is effectively the person who thinks they are being surveilled, identifying whether they're being surveilled. So they're doing it themselves, not like counter-surveillance when we're using other people to identify if they're being surveilled. So those are, I think, the 6 areas of surveillance which I've covered. That is the end of today's episode. Thank you for listening. Please give us a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the content. If you don't want to miss further episodes, then please subscribe to the channel. And until next time, we'll see you then.